now, he doesn't mind me saying, in his 70s, and he looks back over a very long and interesting trajectory of personal development as an artist. And in fact, he and I together in discussion hammered out a framework for this retrospect over his life as an artist in terms of phases of development towards an ever more honed spiritual consciousness. And each stage, in a sense, is also accompanied by a new development in the form language, in the artistic expression itself. And so the way he paints now, at the height of his powers, is in some ways reminiscent of elements of his earliest phase, but it is also a different art in many ways, because at every stage, or so it seems to me, as his spiritual consciousness was developing, so also the art form, the form language, also needed to undergo a development. Now, basically, this book, the book which you can see here, I'm sorry, this is the best I can do. I can hold it up as I would in a lecture room or in the classroom. This book, in fact, therefore, is divided into 7 chapters. And each chapter is devoted to what we call a phase or an epoch in the artistic life of Chaim Meyer. And it starts with his youth and early adulthood, in which he is an artist, I suppose. I like to say, I mean, it's a limited view perhaps, that he has taken over certain elements, maybe you could even say from German Expressionism, but also from other schools. And this early work, the early work here, I don't know if you can see that at all, or is work which has a definite, it has an interest in structures. It documents natural phenomena from the vegetative realm, from the animal realm. It's an art which is looking at the world, which is looking at nature. At the same time, it's an art which is questing a meaning, a wholeness, and a purpose in all of it. But it hasn't. Obviously, this is a very young man, and he has not yet found that synthesis which he would arrive at many decades later. But the interesting thing is that the artistic personality is there. He paints in one can recognize the same person in his latest phase as was in his early day. The school, the language, the form language in broad sense is similar. So, but at all events, and in parallel, there is an interest in religious themes. Here we have a painting which is called Spheres Dancing Across Windows, and that is a clear mystical reference to religious thought. It's not yet tied in, perhaps, with the other work that he does, but the elements, I called it elements of form and spirit, are there at the outset. In 1972, we come to phase 2. He goes overseas. And here is a young man who was not particularly oriented. He knew that something was drawing him towards spirituality from Sinai. And he had clear talent and recognized by his peers and by his teachers. But he goes overseas to England. And there, with visits also to America and so on and so forth, his art develops in certain ways that are, I call it, a first spiritual focusing. He becomes aware of Jewish tradition, and there are some very beautiful images here of the tabernacle in the desert, of Sinai, and so on and so forth, of a cloud. This work is called Anan, moving cloud. This is a reference to the divine presence which went ahead of the Jewish camp in the desert. There are abstract pictures here of the tabernacle and so on and so forth. It is not yet a highly focused or necessarily a highly informed, but he is being drawn more and more now towards Jewish content. Now, then the chapter 3 represents a new phase when he returns now to Australia after a number of years in England with visits to America. And here he begins a very successful phase of his career, working with what's called the Port Jackson Press, which was a premier artist's printing setup. And he there had contact with many famous artists at the same time. But here too, interestingly enough, he's now beginning to accomplish a synthesis between the more developed religious awakening which he'd had overseas, and he is finding the language to express it. There's a brilliant colorist here. There are some very extraordinary pictures coming out here. But but this is, if you like, with this third phase, he accomplishes a first synthesis between a religious consciousness and an art form to express it. But chapter 4, which is devoted to a stage which is in which Rabbi Neuwitz plays an important role. This is where he now becomes rigorously affiliated with Jewish tradition, and he enters a new level of learning, which was not there in the images, beautiful and suggestive as they were. Here you see more focus, and the works of this age, of this period, are one of the highlights of this period are what the Jerusalem drawings, images which were made in Jerusalem where he stayed, and with various ritual references both to the service of the temple, to the service of prayer, to the various items of sanctity which are part of the religious life. This is a very big image here. This image actually hangs in a synagogue in Melbourne. It's called Kedusha in Machne Yehuda. It's a very, very big work, and it's a magnificent work. But this is perhaps maybe one of the greatest pictures of this particular phase. Very, very, very focused, very integrated in its content and form. Now, that is something which, of course, he is on something there of a new spiritual plane altogether. He is locked in. He's connected with the tradition. But now now what is called for is a new level of integration of artistic development with that heightened religious and spiritual consciousness. And here there comes into play this work here, which we called Hamokum. There is this is a huge work, which is about 100 meters of charcoal drawings, very large panels, and 26 of them altogether. And this was a work which traveled around Australia, and it definitely represents a new development in his work altogether. Here this is a focused and honed religious consciousness expressing itself in a new way, even though it had been anticipated in certain forms before. Now, that is that. So now in that last two phases, he'd come to a new level. But in this chapter 6, I think we see him, in my opinion, chapter 6, which I call the developed synthesis and form and spirit at his height. And this is, here we have some very beautiful pictures of actually the Australian bush. The Australian, we call the bush is what this word we call for the native habitat, I suppose, of the countryside. I don't know if we can call it a forest in a European sense, but it is something like that. And here, the trees and the vegetation, so to speak, have become a metaphor for spiritual worlds. And there are 5 pictures here which are particularly outstanding, called the 5 Olamot, the 5 worlds. I've also taken the liberty of naming it after the patron of this picture, the Werdiger pictures, because we have a Melbourne family who commissioned these works, and I think they are quite spectacular. Then later on in this last phase, well, when I say the last phase, it's penultimate phase, because this phase ends in 2014. Chaim Meyer goes into the realm of digital art, and this is work which for me it took me a while to get into this. It's a new medium altogether, but some very remarkable and beautiful things are being accomplished here. I don't know if you can see that on this side we have the splitting of the sea, but accomplished with an extraordinary digital effect. We have pardon? This was part of a exhibition which was held in 2012 called Significant Journeys, which was held in the Jewish Museum of Australia, and these are very vibrant and brilliant abstract works based on the Parshias. They're not wholly abstract. They are, as they say, they're referential, but they merge into a degree of abstraction. And we have some absolutely spectacular images here, where this is it's a new medium for many of us, but the brilliance and form here is something which, in my view, represents a height in his work. And finally, we have an appendix in which the author himself reflects upon these stages of his life, and also the present stage, which is since 2014, but I leave that that's his own reflection. But this was a work which actually was modeled on the concept of teshuvah, the notion that life is about returning to one's spiritual self, and the book seeks to document through the phases of this teshuvah, of this return to the highest spiritual consciousness of his own life, which is that which he currently possesses. Anyway, it's the work of Chaim Meyer does not need my endorsement. It's in the Tate Gallery, it's in the National Gallery of Australia. But what is exciting here is that a significant artist chose to render his whole artistic creativity into a form which expresses spiritual concepts and spiritual ideals. So later, for those who wish to acquire this book, whether in this form in print, which of course is the easiest, most pleasant way, or in an ebook, which is due to come out in a week, we'll speak about that at the very end. Now, I think I've used quite a budget of my time already, but I just want to take a couple more minutes to speak about the concept of religion and art in general. Here, I'm sorry, forgive the advertisement. I refer here to a book which I wrote called Aesthetics and the Divine. Now, this is also an ebook on Amazon. You can get it, or you can get it in Australia from the publisher. At all events, the interesting thing about art and Torah is as follows. This is an insight to which I came, and I'm happy to hear other people's thoughts as well. And there will be time for discussion, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts as we go on. Now, somebody once said, it was a great philosopher called the German philosopher Hegel, who said that art is the sensual representation of the absolute. Now, that's pretty difficult language, but what it means is that the ultimate reality, what is ultimate reality? That's what Hegel called the absolute. We could call it God, from a religious point of view, or godliness in the creation. How art is that which represents it. Now, of course, you have a problem if it represents it in a visual and a sensual manner, as distinct from philosophical and theological discussion. So the question arises, how can art possibly picture the divine? The divine is something which is beyond description. God has no definition, no form, and he's, because any form which we could attribute is something which is just a projection of our own finite intellect and understanding. And this is the creator of intellect and the creator of understanding. So therefore, it occurred to me that the major function of art in a Jewish concept, and I believe this would be also in a Noahide context, because we have here at this seminar many people who are not Jewish, but who are Noahides. And what that means is that they are observant of the commandments of the Torah for the nations of the world. They have their portion also in the Torah. And this is of importance to them too. So since we cannot represent God in any way, how then could we latch on to the divine in an artistic sense? So the way in which it occurred to me that this is done, basically, is that the way in which we connect to God is through Torah and mitzvot, through the divine teaching and through the divine commandments. That's how we access the divine. It's not through understanding, it's not through cognition, it's through connection. And so therefore, art, religious art in this sense, has a very important role to play as that which enhances or beautifies or illustrates the connections that we have to the divine through Torah and the commandments. And that means, for example, that it could be that art could be expressing or relating to a particular commandment. For example, in this book, there were various. I considered also literature. It considered also music, and there were various ways in which for example, one writer, Richard Friedman, was writing a book about his father, and it was the idea there. This was a struggle in the whole issue of honoring of one's father. Now, the honoring of one's father is actually a Torah precept, and he was able to build a creative literary work around that notion itself. And with Victor Majzner, who is here today, we collaborated, and he was the artist, and I was the mentor in the spiritual sense, and talker. We based ourselves again on a Torah text. So therefore, art very often, in a Jewish sense, must take its bearings from Torah itself to illustrate Torah, or from mitzvahs to illustrate, to illuminate. And this too is what Chaim Meyer is doing. He is taking the physical world as a metaphor for the spiritual, and these spiritual concepts, they come from the study of Torah. The works, for example, the work called the Five Worlds, that concept of five worlds is a Torah concept, and his art illustrates it. So art is something in Torah. It needs to connect with Torah and its commandments in some way. And when it does that, then we have already the basic ingredients. Now, of course, Jewish art or Torah art, by definition, has to be both. It has to be Jewish or Torah-based. It has to be knowledgeable. It has to be Noahide. There could be great Noahide artists as well. But at the same time, obviously, we're talking about art in its highest form, as art as possessing real caliber. We don't put down anybody who is not of that caliber, but we're talking about art as we're talking about art as something which is world class art, which is religiously and spiritually informed. It's a special combination. It's an unusual combination, and it's something to which we aspire. And I'm very honored to have been associated with Victor Majzner and with Chaim Meyer in way either to help, to collaborate in some way, as I did in a mentoring or educational way with Victor, and to be able to birth in some way as a writer the presentation to the world of Chaim Meyer's work, although I'm not the first person to do so. This is a very exciting thing. So that we have here basically this extraordinary coalescence between informed religiosity and top artistic caliber. Now I'm going to stop talking for a while. I'll be more a questioner, but I would like to hear now from Victor Majzner, whom I'm grateful to. I'm very grateful to him for coming. Now, Victor Majzner, Dr. Victor Majzner, was the head of painting in the Victorian College of the Arts. He's now retired from that and is more furiously producing artistic production, probably as a result of being freed from his teaching commitments. But he's a very important artist, and it's a pleasure for me to have him with us. And I'd like to ask Victor, I'd like to ask you some questions. Now, the first question I have to ask you is, my understanding from you is that your work has been included in a recent World Survey of Jewish Art. Now, I'd like you, based on that, to let us know perhaps where we are in the art world in this respect at present. Is there more religiously inspired art amongst Jewish painters or other painters than there was? What's the trend?
Well, it's a very complex question. First of all, Mazel Tov and congratulations on your book, and Mazel Tov to Chaim as well. It's a very splendid publication. But before I answer your question, I just want to refer to something you mentioned. And you mentioned the German philosopher Hegel, who said something brilliant about spirituality and art. But he was also a huge anti-Semite at the same time. And this is what he wrote about Judaism and art in a book that he termed The Spirit of Christianity and Its Fate. He decides that Jews are spiritually empty. And this is, in his mind, was reflected in the emptiness, in inverted commas, of all of their creations. Their sanctuary was an empty room. The day dedicated to their invisible God, as you mentioned, was an empty time. He goes on to suggest that the intolerant and domineering God is jealous of the reverence of the image. Now, he was coming at it from a Christian perspective, and Christianity has a long history of image making. Judaism, on the other hand, is very bereft of images. We are known as the people of the book, as the people of the sound, as the people of the word, rather than the image. Now, from the very beginning, however, certainly from the very beginning of Jewish history, from biblical times, Jews always made art. But it's never been recorded except for the Bible, right, which is replete with artworks. In the 20th century, there was a rekindling, if you like, amongst Jews and amongst Jewish artists in particular, of the idea of being able to make images from a Jewish perspective without any compromise to Judaism itself, be it from a religious point of view or be it from a secular point of view, because Jewish art encompasses a broad range of art making. We are both a religion and a people. So as a religion, we deal with orthodox ideas, with the ideas of the Torah, of learning, of studying. But as a people, we also deal with the everyday, the here and now, the ordinary, if you like. And as in Meyer's case, he takes the ordinary, he takes the Australian bush and elevates it into this incredibly spiritual place. So there was an awakening in the early part of the 20th century, and I think it's sort of speeding up in the early part of the 21st century, where there are more and more Jewish artists who are interested in both Judaism and art making, in that sort of combination that you mentioned before, the spirituality and image making. They don't see any contradiction in the second commandment, for instance, which for a very long time seemed to be a sort of limitation to art making. We no longer see that as a prohibition. In fact, there's been a sort of large number of books written about the second commandment and the meaning of it, and what it means to Jews in particular, and Jewish artists in particular. There is a latest book by, let me just get it. by Melissa Raphael, Judaism and the Visual Image. I think it's something, Shimon, I'm going to lend to you very shortly. And she talks about a theology of Jewish art, which is very apt because we live in an age where there seems to be a sort of schism between secular ideology and religious ideology, just like there is a schism between the left and the right in politics as well, the extremes. Art is something that brings the two extremes together. It's a sort of, if you like, a kind of coalescence of ideas in the image, in the visual image, be it in sculptural form or in visual form or in musical form or in words, in poetry and so on. So my view is I can't speak generally for the world because I'm not really the authority to speak on that. But from a visual art perspective, I see more and more artists, Jewish artists, involved in art making, which is really very unusual for our time. So I'm very hopeful, I'm very optimistic about the possibility of Jewish art having a sort of place amongst world art on the same level as every other religious art has, whether it's Buddhist art or Christian art or Islamic art or what have you. I don't know if that answered your question.
Right, thank you for that. In fact, it's a very comprehensive answer. You were a head of painting at Victoria College of the Arts. Can you tell me?
My sins, yes.
Well, I'm sure that it sounds quite a meritorious. I'm giving you a chance to redo it now. Here's the question: a hypothetical. Even though I think it's if you were transported back there now with your current knowledge and so on and so forth, how would you approach students with regard to this with their spirituality and their art? In other words, was there a certain prejudice built into the university, built into the tertiary realm against the expression of the spiritual? Was there a self-imposed cringe on the part of the students about it if they had it? How would you now, if you were before students, how would you now approach their inner spiritual questings and so on and so forth? Would there be some way which you felt you could now evoke it more? The climate had changed to allow it to be evoked further?
The only way I always did, by example. I mean, I don't know if you remember, but I invited you to give a lecture at the VCA as well on the topic of Jewish art and, in fact, the spirituality in Jewish art. So, yes, I think, there always was an interest amongst students in the spiritual. However, the academy, if you like, the kind of orthodoxy of the academy was very secular. And it was really very much against the idea of expressing the spiritual through imagery. Partly because of the recent contemporary art history, starting from German Expressionism, as you mentioned, right up to conceptual art, which dealt with really secular ideas and dealt with a kind of physicality of ideas rather than a spirituality of ideas. So yes, there was a kind of cringe element, if you like, or a critical approach to religious art. But toward the end of my time at the VCA, I felt that it was waning. It was becoming less so. There was a more broad-minded approach to all kinds of art making. And in fact, there were all sorts of books being published. The very recent one is Art and Religion by a Jewish author, Aaron Rosen, who's a very fine writer. He's written a lot about art, spirituality, and Jewish art in particular, where he takes all religions and deals with art in a contemporary sense. These are artists who are making art today all over the world, in various countries. He is originally based in England, in Oxford, now in America, but his interest is global. So according to him, there is a growth in the sort of spirituality when it comes to art making. And in fact, if you take some very contemporary events, if you take, for example, a current exhibition that's in Melbourne at the National Gallery Victoria, it's a triennial exhibition of world art, where they bring art from all over the world. And the majority of installations have a spiritual content. There is an aura about the presence of the work, which hasn't existed for a very long time. So my approach, if I was teaching today, would be to include the students in my ideas. And I taught by example. What I was as an artist was the sort of stuff that I tried to expose the students to, my reference points, my range of reading, etc., as well as involve visiting artists and scholars like yourself, who broaden the viewpoints about art and about life generally.
Well, thank you for that. That gives us a little bit of hope, because we'd like to see, as I once, it occurred to me that
as well,
people think art is something recondite, but as we know that every country boy and girl study Shakespeare. Every half decent town has got an art gallery. And so we know the importance of art. People might say it's not for the mass, but nevertheless, society recognizes the importance of art. And therefore, if we have artists who are able to give a spiritual message, that must have, in some, either the shorter or the longer term, a very important effect on the culture as a whole. So it's
absolutely.
So thank you for those hopeful words.
Can I just add one other thing? I mean, all sorts of cultures, be it Christian or Buddhist cultures, have had a long history of spirituality in their art. We have a problem as Jews. We have a problem, and that is we don't encourage our youngsters, our students, to get involved in Jewish art. We don't have the patrons. I mean, the Werdigers that you mentioned are very, very few and far between who can sponsor Jewish art. We don't have the patronage, we don't have the galleries that will expose Jewish art, apart from the museums, which occasionally put on exhibitions of Jewish art. We as Jews have a major, major problem because we don't encourage the making of visual art. Our rabbis, the majority of whom, would discourage making art. That's also a problem. So we've got a lot of internal work to do, and I'm really pleased that you are doing a major sort of groundbreaking work where you're trying to encourage the visual in your quest. So well, congratulations.
Thank you for being part of the movement. Okay, well, now we have the artist himself. Now, before we bring Chaim Meyer, who's unfortunately forced to share the screen with me here. I hope I won't distract you too much from him. I just want to mention to all of those who are joining us today that we'd like to hear your comments and questions, and we will have a time for that after we've spoken with the artist, Chaim Bill Meyer. Chaim, now I've got some questions for you, and sure others will also. Now, in your book, you say that when you were approaching the latter stages of your work, and you came into a religious community, and you became you entered a realm of learning, of real informing of your art spiritually, that you cut ties to a certain extent with the networks of artists with whom you'd been involved in the past, and they were very significant networks because you were if I remember, the president of the press
print council.
Of the print council, which is quite an important role in Australian art. Now, my question to you is not so much why it happened, what it happened, but do you see that those ties have been broken, in the sense that even as a religious artist now, you could talk to those secular artists with whom you interacted in those days and that they might understand you, that you might have a common discourse? How would it be if you could view that somewhat hypothetically?
Well, I don't think it's all that hypothetical, actually, because the contacts were broken, but it was for pragmatic reasons in many cases. Pardon my voice, it's gone.
I'll give you some water. You continue.
I resigned from the print council presidency because simply I had other things to do. At that stage, I had a learning program which started at very early hours of the morning, was with a bit of Gemara and a bit of Musa, with Rabbi and a small group of other people who I'm still in contact with. The day didn't finish till around about 10 o'clock at night. And with all that going on, there wasn't much room really for the print council. So I resigned. The chap who took over from me was actually then became the head of the Australian Prints and Drawings up in Canberra at the National Gallery. He's just recently retired. So I didn't really break loose from those contacts with other artists as a matter of some sort of ideological factor at all. But when time is at a premium, you have to make priorities. And I was at that stage working with Port Jackson Press as a master printmaker, and that took up a lot of my time just earning panossa and doing the best I could for the other artists. And I was working with them in a professional manner, having to interpret their ideas, and without imposing too much of my own personality on what I did. Thank you so much. I have to confess there was some imposition, because a couple of artists in particular would leave me with nothing but a sort of handful of small drawings, or even just sometimes a few words to indicate what they wanted to be done with their ideas in printmaking. I had to sort of work from there and create something out of their what was actually not very much information. A lot of dialogue did take place with those artists. I remember talking with Michael Lunig at one point, and Michael, I can't say he's, shall we say, 100% in accord with the ideas that I would have been espousing then, and would be certainly talking about now. But one thing we did have in common was a love for puns. And I pointed out to him that this actually was Midas Shem, that this was natural. Shimon just talked a minute ago about how we can't really portray Hashem. We can in one sense, through learning, but also, and through mitzvahs, but also we can portray Hashem through our actions and through emulating midos. That's emulating the midos Hashem.
Attributes.
The attributes. We see those attributes in the Sephiros, which we consider, it's now coming up to Pesach, and we'll be considering those attributes as we count down the Omer until Shavuos. Now, all of that is bringing, if you like, the spiritual into the mundane, or the Gashmias world, the physical world. One of the things that I remember, just following one particular line of thought here, of a conversation as an example about how I was able to relate to those artists at that time, a time of great change for myself, and still retain a sense of humor and still retain some artistic connection. And anyway, Michael, who really has a very bizarre sense of humor, said, well, I really love puns. I said, yes. So we made a few really bad puns. And he said, I can hear the pun police up ahead, up above. And he pointed up through the roof of this basement studio we're in. And he said, "Do you hear that helicopter?" He said, "The pun police, they go around in helicopters, you know. And when they hear a really bad pun like you just made, they come down and they descend on you." And I thought, "That's very nice, Michael. I really like that." And it appeared a few weeks later in one of his newspaper cartoons of the pun police chasing after punsters. But then I thought to myself, actually, it's Hashem who comes down and gives us good for you chaps on a really great pun or bad pun. I'm deliberately choosing something which is fairly minor, you might say, and seemingly unimportant here, puns. But it's not. It connects with words. It connects with the whole concept of devar. The word devar is not just a word, it is a thing, as in the German, a ding. But a thing, a devar, like in a lot of Hebrew, Lashon Kodesh, a lot of Hebrew words have many, many layers of meaning. And that idea of the word and a thing, similarly dissimilar, actually tell you an awful lot about what Yiddishkeit is about. Because the word encompasses the thing, the word encompasses that. And another friend of mine used to sort of talk about the pun of the week. You go through the weekly parsha, and over the third meal that we have, Shabbos Sudas, he would come up with a little drosh, little vort about the particular pun of the week that he came. Well, half the time I had no idea what he was talking about. I'm not a linguist or a philologist, but it was great fun. We had good fun. So I would like to make that as a sort of an answer to the thing. I haven't broken contact with those people. There's always a point that you can contact, reach them with, even if it is not directly in the line of something overtly Yiddish.
Right, but still there is the challenge of getting a full frontal engagement with the secular culture.
Absolutely.
So that's
absolutely.
it is two worlds. It is two worlds in a way, but it's a world which we want to bridge as much as we can. Let me ask you another question. This question is a question which is similar to the question which I asked Victor. Now, Victor was taught tertiary age students at the Victoria College of the Arts, but there was a short time when you were a teacher in a school, Beth Rivka.
Correct.
Now, let me ask you, if you were now, if you had the koiches, the strength and the ability and so all the other conditions to go back to school teaching, how would you relate, how would you teach students who are 16, 17, 18 in a religious school? How would you teach them art?
With great difficulty, I'd say. But seriously, I also taught at JFS Jewish Free School in London, which was partly financed by the Sochnut and partly by the Inner London Council. And that was only a few years after the Grishka experience back in the 70s. It was interesting that then I'd very little to sort of go on. I'd sort of was hardly even through my own learning process in a formal sense, and I certainly hadn't developed my own language. I did the best I could, but I think the thing that got through, and people do remember me from that era, and they talk about enthusiasm. And I think that hasn't gone away. And I think if I was talking or relating to 16, 17-year-old students today in a formal or religious school of some sort, I wouldn't be teaching them about techniques. One of my own teachers once said to my father, when my father accused him of not teaching me technical drawing, the teacher just looked at him and said very quietly, he says, he'll come to that when he needs it. And that's exactly what happened to me when I found I really needed the language to be able to draw. I then learned it. What I needed from teaching and from teachers in my own life was the enthusiasm and the idea that there was an imperative to make art. And that's what I'd be trying to getting across to them. Now that art can be in any form. It can be visual, it can be musical, it can be gardening, it can be cooking, it can be writing, it can be schmoozing, whatever. But it is something about, and the concept that I was trying to get across when I was talking to Reb Shimon about this book that has just come out, was the idea of the artist as Eved Hashem. The artist as not as a slave, as an Ovid, but as an Eved, a servant or a worker. Again, very subtle distinctions in the Lashon, in the word itself. It's change of a vowel, but it changes the whole meaning of the word from somebody who is enslaved by something to somebody who is liberated by actually giving oneself up to a concept or a way of life. Very big difference, and yet it's a change of one vowel sound from Ovid to Eved.
Well, that's as you can see my probing and my prompting is that we need more people like, we need more Jewish artists, more Noahide artists, more artists who bring together the divine and the artist and art. So that's why I'm pushing and probing and asking, how can it be done? And let me just start pushing along these lines. Let's indulge in one more fantasy, if we may. Let us supposing somebody would come along, a big patron, and set up a new Port Jackson press. In other words, and put you in the head and place you in at the head of it, something of that sort, a situation where you could do work with other artists and so on and so forth. How would you, in this situation, how would you utilize this opportunity to draw on artists, to mentor artists, to bring artists toward you in a way which would be open and friendly, perhaps, towards the spiritual?
Okay, back again to examples. When I was still with the Print Council of Australia, I curated an exhibition called Print as Object. And to do that, I traveled around Australia for more than a year, interviewing various artists, going to various art schools, talking with artists in their studios and so on. And eventually we put together an exhibition, which was trying to push the limits of what a print actually was, and how it was defined, and to make the most exciting exhibition I could do. Well, it caused a lot of trouble. It was almost shut down in Brisbane at one point. Anyway, it was good. It was good fun, and it was all one of the reasons why I also resigned from the Print Council. It got too tough after that. Now, what I would do if I was back in a position where I had that type of, shall we say, pull to be able to maneuver things, I think I would seriously I would have to try and search out those artists. I'd certainly do the formal invitations to people. There would certainly be all the artists who one would be able to contact quite easily, but there'd be also those other artists who would be hidden, that needed to be brought out, that needed to be discovered. I'm not talking about the business of, oh, let's do new generation artists or something like that. No, I'm talking about the artists who possibly wouldn't even come out if you offered them an exhibition. You actually have to go and find them sometimes. Now, if I was in a position of some sort of power in an organization, like a new or another version of Port Jackson, because Port Jackson Press still exists, but in a new form. So it'll be another type of organization, which I think what you were talking about was where the original idea of Port Jackson was inviting artists almost as a collaborative thing, almost not a communal thing, but a collaborative thing, where Port Jackson would actually sponsor portfolios. That's how I got started. I was sponsored for 3 different portfolios by David Rankin, who was then the director. It really got me started. And he did not lay down any restrictions on what that was to be. I told him the first one, the gap, which was based on very clear concepts of tzimtzum and not exactly easy stuff. He didn't bat an eyelid. That was fine. I'd do the same thing. I think I'd be emulating what was done to me, because I think I was very fortunate that I had very good people around at the right time.
Well, that sounds like a site we need now. An enlightened sponsor and patron to step forward to promote important religious art now. Well, I think it's time now. Thank you for listening until now. Now it's time to hear from any of you, any of the participants who would like to ask questions of any of us, of artist, of me, or Victor, or make a comment. Please step forward. And Chaim, could you unmute them? I mean, we need to Chaim, Daniel, we need to unmute everybody, please. I'm just asking the host to
Sure, no
unmute.
worries. I'm going to unmute it.
Because I can see that they're muted now. Can we unmute everybody? I think can we go through unmuting everybody here? What happened? Let's see. Wait a minute.
It's unmuted now, Rabbi.
Unmuted. Very good. Okay. Would anybody like to make a comment or ask a question?
Yeah, I think this is Leo from Indonesia, Rabbi. And the comments from me as a Noahide, definitely we look forward for a Jews to pioneering in this area, because like mentioned by Dr. Victor previously, you know, in the world of creating an image, Jews is, and basically all of us that is adhere to Torah, it's basically quote unquote kind of like a limited kind of things, right? Because we do not want to transgress any of the commandments, because we would like to, as much as possible, do that mitzvot and obey the commandments. So in this area, definitely as a Noahide, we would like to see a Torah, what you call it, a Torah compliance. I would like to say that art is flourishing, as well as so that we can also enjoy. And I believe, because I'm not an artist, but definitely I understand that the art has to do something with our emotion, and even our spirituality. It can give an effect of reflection, refreshment, something like that. So we are looking forward, as a Noahide, we are looking forward this work to be flourished, Rabbi, and also Chaim Meyer. Thank you so much for having this work.
Thank you for your comment. Anybody else?
If I may say something, I'm sorry that's speaking to a dear friend, Chaim, here in New York, where it's past midnight. I just wanted to make one thought, listening to Chaim, and Shimon, listen to you as well, about the spirituality and the Judaism and art. I'm reminded of a story they say over about a young Hasidic student meeting with his rabbi, and he and the rabbi were eating, and he asked his rabbi, I don't understand what the difference is between you and I. You're eating and I'm eating. I don't see any difference. The rabbi answered, I want to praise God. I have such a love for God, but I realize that I can't just go ahead and make a blessing in God's name unless I eat something. So I first have to eat, and therefore I can make the blessing. But my purpose for eating is to make the blessing. Whereas in your case, you want to eat, but you know you can only eat if you make a blessing. So you're making the blessing because you want to eat. That's the difference. I think within Chaim, we see his desire to bring out the greatness of God and the love of God for the people. And he needs a medium to be able to do that. and he uses the art. The art world is the way that he's able to present that, but it's coming out of a sense of great loyalty and love towards God himself. And I think that's something we can greatly appreciate. In therefore, the warmth that comes out, the fire that comes out in his productions, and as such, the inspiration that we can draw from it, because it's coming from that source. So thank you so much, Chaim, and you'll excuse me if I go to sleep for the evening.
Thank you very much for staying up so late.
Okay.
That was in order that people in Los Angeles could take part after shows. Yes. Anybody else?
I have a question.
Please.
I'm an artist of about 30 odd years. I used to teach. I had a big studio, and I know that when certain people want to just paint certain things that went against my beliefs, I had to struggle with that, and it was very difficult. Like if somebody wanted to come in and draw a Buddha, what do you do with that when that's their belief? So that was always a struggle for me. And so I had to stand my ground on a number of times where I couldn't participate or help them draw that. And my husband at the moment has just gone into Orthodox Christianity. And the biggest arguments we've been having, especially we've been watching Tovia Singer, is the fact that they use so much imagery, so many icons. They call it, the Russian Orthodox calls them icons, not idols. So where can we draw that line though, where it goes from, it can turn into something like what you'd call an icon. So my husband could easily turn to me and say, look at all the paintings you have around the house. They're images, and God says don't create images of anything on heaven and earth, blah, blah, blah. So, I mean, I used to struggle with that as a Christian. Sometimes I think, am I doing the right thing? But then again, God gave me this gift, and, and I would paint animals. I'd also paint buildings, or I'd go overseas and find some nice old streets and paint that. So it wasn't anything particular that I was worshipping. I think I did one of Moses sitting at the burning bush. I have no idea what it would look like for him, but it was my
What did he look like? I always wanted to know what Moses looked like.
So I said, I don't know what he looked like. His clothes were probably totally wrong. I wish I had it in my hand right now. I'd show you what I did. But anyway, so where do we draw? What I'm asking is, where does an artist, and I don't know what I call myself. I'm not a Noahide or a Jew. I don't know what I am at the moment. I'm just trying to find my place again after coming out of Christianity. But where does my art, where does it draw the line?
Chaim would like to answer that, I think. Yes.
There's just a few issues you brought up. One of them was about the second commandment, which everyone, I think, seems to refer to.
Very hard to hear.
Sorry. Yes. Yeah,
get closer to the mic. Yeah.
Many people refer to the second commandment, which is probably one of the most misunderstood commandments of the so-called Aseret Divros, the 10 commandments. It's not about image making per se. It's about engraved images to start, which means sculptural images.
Okay.
Specifically. So two-dimensional images are in fact not covered by that at all. That's number one. And there's a number, I won't go into all the details, but there's quite a range of stuff there. The other thing you brought up was the idea of idolatry yes, I suppose you could say idolatry. We're not allowed in Judaism. We're not allowed to get benefit from the idols. They're called avodah zarah, literally strange things. We're not allowed to get benefit from those. On the other hand, if it's somebody else's religion and somebody's saying, we don't have a right to actually condemn that. we let them go ahead, but we don't partake of it. We don't get involved in that. There have been stories about how, you know, the iconoclasts, for example, of the medieval, not just the medieval time, but even later in the 18th and 19th century, went around smashing up the images in Catholic churches, for example. They did the same thing in countries like Cambodia, and I think there's a few other places where they smashed up idols of Buddha, and Buddha was not a god. Buddha was a human being, and they made statues of the Buddha, but it was not of as Buddha as a god. So you couldn't.
But they worship it still. I just had 2 days away at a place, and I didn't realise until I'd booked it and I arrived, there was absolutely everywhere Buddhas on every corner of this place, and they even handed me prayer beads when I got there, and I just said, "Oh, I had an old Bible in my hand." I said, "I've got this, thanks," you know. But they do seem to really worship that these days. It's like everywhere.
But I'm saying I think one has to be very careful there, and you have to respect them, and also we have certain obligations, but we can't really condemn.
No, I didn't say anything rude or anything like that. I just said, but thank you, I've got my Bible here. And he said, "Gee, that looks really old." And I said, "No, it's not. I just read it a lot." That's all I said. I just left the prayer beads there. I didn't take the prayer beads. I left them in the room and the book. So I suppose that was a statement in itself. I told him I had a Bible and that's all I needed, you know.
It's probably a very diplomatic way of doing it.
Yeah, well.
I mean, there's one case where I did have somebody who came into the studio when I was working for Port Jackson with a series of images that I refused to print. But that was more on, I think you might say, I wouldn't say moral grounds, but it had to do with the imagery was just simply something I couldn't countenance.
Yes.
And I had the choice of doing them or not doing them. I chose not to engage in those.
Any other comments?
Thank you.
By the way, the questions you're asking are very important questions, and there are it's an important. There are what we call halachas. There are laws relating to this, but maybe I'd be very pleased to I could refer you to some of these rules on location.
My comments on that were actually based on halakha, so it wasn't just my own personal opinion.
Thank you.
Good.
Anyone else? Any other?
Yes.
I just got a question. Sorry, you're all right.
Yeah, I'm actually a photographic artist. I did my bachelor's and everything, and having become a Noahide, I must admit I've kind of been in this the same kind of struggle. So I must admit the question of how does art fit with Judaism and Noahidism, since we're Torah based, and and especially with the visual art, and I do get it because I've kind of been going through this mental struggle myself for the last 5 years, because I was taught, you know, there's always 3 people within a work. There's the artist, there's the actual work, and there's the viewer. And I think the thing that I've struggled with I suppose the most is because I'm also aware of semiotics, and that's the language of the image, because the viewer can only bring their knowledge of that language to the image. So there's that fear of the misinterpretation, even with an artist statement. So yes, I've been thinking more along the lines of Minor White, an American photographer, for those that aren't familiar. And he used the form of the equivalent, which I see that you have used within your artwork, with the Australian bush and the 5 worlds. There's the equivalent. Yeah, that's a rough translation of a very simple word. So I think we, as Noahide artists, I'm coming from that same kind of perspective because all my artwork is visual. And I think that's the discussion that I think needs to be held, is how as visual artists we get around the semiotics of our work.
Well, this is not a question maybe which we can answer just on one foot, but I will say one general.
It's more of a statement than a
Oh,
question.
I know Pat is waiting to ask a question in a minute. It's one thing that's very exciting here is that we have not just Jewish people, but Noahides, people who are oriented to the Torah, who are not Jewish. Now, this is something which I think this massively increases the pool of talent. So it's a very good thing that Noahides are drawn into this discussion because there's loads of talent around. And this is something which maybe on another occasion we can, if any of you would like to contact me, I'm happy to, maybe we'll organize a seminar in which we'll actually discuss these questions more concretely. By the way, my email address is on the flyer, shimoncowen@gmail.com. So please contact me. Now, Pat, you have a question?
Yeah, I was just going to make maybe a statement, I guess, was one of the things I read somewhere about this idols is that there is a requirement if you have an idol is to what was it, like, I forget the actual wording, nullify it by breaking its nose off or its ear off, or probably better off getting rid of it. But yes, I read that in one of my Noahide books.
Right, well, that's let me just tell you what that means practically speaking.
Yeah,
it means if you're an antique dealer, right?
Yeah.
Now, and you've got some extraordinary sort of voodoos or something like it, totems. Yeah. In your stock. Now this is idolatry. Yeah. However, if that idolatry has actually been nullified by one of its adherents, then it becomes something from which you can derive benefit afterwards. In other words, they're going to have to, if you don't stub your nose at it or snub its nose off or do something with it, then, and particularly when the adherent does that, then it becomes something which is permissible to derive benefit from. That's just by the way.
I found the picture. Somebody wanted to see what Moses looked like.
Yeah, I did.
Have a look.
I did.
Well,
here he is.
All right.
He's hiding his face, so he can't. He's hiding his face from the fire.
That's right.
All right.
Okay.
You must have been watching a lot of Hollywood movies.
It's quite. Even if Charlton Heston, who was it? Who is Moses? That it could also be of some value.
Did you realize that Moses was the first Jewish artist?
How do you get that?
Well, think about it. The very first Jewish artist was Hashem himself, because he made the 2 tablets himself. And then when Moses smashed them, God instructed him to make the 10 Commandments. That's the first Jewish art object.
Okay. Well, do we have any more questions or comments?
I would like to know whether Mr. Meyer also engaged in other forms of art rather than only the visual.
Yes. Oh, right. Yes. Okay. Yes, I do actually. In this book that Rabbi Cohen's put together, I talk about, in an appendix, I talk about a 7th epoch, which he hasn't written about, which I thought was important. And I talk about sound, and I talk about music. It's something I learned. I've been doing working with music for quite some years, in fact, most of my life. But it hasn't, it's always given second place to the visual work. As I'm getting older and getting further into certain readings, particularly by one rabbi, Aryeh Kaplan, who talks about Jewish meditation, and he talks about sound, and that Jewish meditation can be defined as, in fact, the prayers that we make, or the way what's called davening. Now, I've used that, and I've used that concept of sound, and this concept of harmony and concept of melody, but harmony becomes the dominant thing. And this has become very important in my visual work, but it's also become very important in the audio material that I've been working with. So yes, the answer to that is yes, I do work in another medium, and at the moment I'm also doing some writing.
Anything more? Any other comments? Yes, Yosef.
It's a very interesting seminar today. Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, Mr. Chaim. It's very good. And I am, as a visual artist, just I need to know the line between a normal artist and Jewish artist. What art God help you? The Torah said, don't carve, don't do stuff like sculpture or worship pictures. My art, I can show some art from my phone, but I need to know how I can describe, as a Noahide person, how I can describe the art God will be use it for his mission. Excuse me if I go to from my iPhone, you will see iPhone here. I show some art here. I don't know, did you see this one? Did you see that one from my iPhone?
Oh, where is it?
Down here.
Where is that?
It says iPhone.
Yeah, no, up.
Did you see it?
Left.
We can't see you.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I see. Okay, good.
That's my artwork here.
Right.
It's all about history and ancient pharaohs and this stuff. If I go to Noahide artist, which kind of art I can go, like which line should be the artist, district the artist to do art for Noahide?
Well, the answer is that, like a Jewish person. Now, but that doesn't answer your question. But this is the answer. The restrictions are relatively few, very few. But there's no reason why we cannot. A sculpture can be a little bit problematic. But even there may be ways to do it. Yes. Okay, and the scope is in fact much greater than you think. The main thing is to get into the spirit of what it is that we are representing, what we're doing, what we're portraying. It's the message.
I do cast and mold silicone with the camera. I just was thinking last month how I can do 3D of arc, for example. If I do 3D of arc, half of my canvas, and written some verses around, but with 3D. Is any problem with the 3D?
The only issues of three-dimensional is a full sculpture of a human being in 3 dimensions. That raises an issue. But that itself, there are ways in which you can do that without transgressing the prohibition. The Torah set up a prohibition about representing a person 3-dimensionally, so the person shouldn't come, I suppose, ultimately to worship a human being who's made in the image of God in some sense. But the restrictions are relatively few, and we can easily discuss that at length. The most important thing is that you want to express your Noahide faith as an artist, and that the scope is immense.
Just one small comment on that. The restrictions, as Reb Shimon said, are actually very limited. What's important is what you might call the intent of the art. It's more about the intent. That's what makes it spiritual. it's not the subject matter, it's not the content. You can draw your subject matter from any source you like, whatever is relevant to you. But it's your intention about transforming that material. It's not about representing that material or portraying that material. It's what your intention is in using that material, and whether it has some sort of spiritual intent. I think that's
an intent which is consistent with Torah values and ideals. Anyway, look, I think now we have to bring this seminar to an end. I'm very grateful to you all for participating. I want to thank particularly Chaim Meyer and Dr. Victor Majzner, for their time and their contributions. And now to all of you, it's a book launch. Maybe the main purpose of this lecture was to get the idea of the importance of art in a religious sense. But if any of you wish to acquire this book, it's going to be selling for $40, but for anybody who wants can get this for $20 now as a special with a participant, a launch special. It'll be $20 plus postage. So email me if you'd like a copy. And in addition to all of that, and of course, to repeat, my email address is shimoncowen, all one word, @gmail.com. It's on the flyer. So, and in addition to that, it will, please goodness, it will be coming out as an ebook. It'll be coming out as an ebook for the which you can buy from Amazon, and presumably it'll be much less expensive. So thank you, and I thank you for your kind comments, and thank you for your questions, and thank you for your time. And I do appreciate. I've acknowledged that there's some messages that are coming to us. We thank you for those messages. And please God, let there be one result from all of this, and that is that we will have more Torah art, whether from Jews or from Noahites. Art is something that the Chinese say that a picture is worth 1,000 words. So therefore, there must be a tremendous power in the image. Let's use it for holiness and goodness. So, and I want to thank Chaim Daniel in Toronto. It's 12:30 at night. Thank you very much for staying up and running this, Chaim Daniel. So bless you all. Thank you very much, and hope to stay in touch. All the best. Bye.
Rabbi, before you leave, oh, he left. All right.